Okay. Well, good morning. Good to see you all. Good to be here. Nice weather. It's turned a little bit cool, which is kind of nice. We know that that will change. That will change. Well, I'll tell you what. I have had a great time in Ruth and Esther. And I'm kind of sad to see it coming to an end, to tell you the truth. I've just really enjoyed our time talking about these two books, these two ladies, and the other characters in these two books. And so we want to pick up now with the closing of the story of Esther. And so let's pray, and then we'll get started. Father, thanks for the day that you've given to us. Help us never to be neglectful of thanking you for the new day, because we know that's not always true for folks that lose loved ones, and the new day is not always forthcoming, and we thank you for that. Father, it's been a blessing to look at the stories of Ruth and Esther, and it's just been an encouragement and a challenge. And we just pray that as we wrap that up, that we will learn the lessons that we ought to learn from these two stories. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. So, Ruth 9, verse 20 through 10, verse 3. That is the conclusion of the book. And again, just a real quick review. We've gone from the grand party of Ahasuerus and Vashti's side party, and then Ahasuerus' request that Vashti come and entertain the dignitaries, and her refusal to do so, leading to her deposition, her being removed from being the queen. That opened the door for a search for a new queen, and it just so happened that Esther got involved in that process, and it just so happened that Esther was the one who caught the eye of the eunuch who was in charge. It just so happened that Esther also caught King Ahasuerus' eye and became queen without the knowledge of Esther being a Jew. But we also saw that it just so happened there was another guy in town named Haman, and Haman was one of those who was of the lineage of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were the enemy of Israel from the very beginning, from the time that they were on their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, through the kingdom of Saul. They were enemies and cursed by God. And so Haman is of that lineage, and it just so happened that he was there too, and had become elevated himself in position to number 2 in the kingdom. And the only problem with that was, in his eyes anyway, there was this Jew, the hated Jew, Mordecai, who would not bend the knee. And that infuriated Haman to the point that he hatches that plot to kill all the Jews. At that point, of course, Mordecai becomes aware of that. By the way, Mordecai, remember, he had become aware also of a plot to assassinate Ahasuerus, and was able to foil that plot. And that got recorded in the books, in the Chronicles of the Kings of the Medes and the Persians. But he also became aware of Haman's plot and compels Esther, the queen, Esther, to go to the king and beg for some sort of relief. That was a dangerous thing, as we saw, that Esther could have been rejected in her approach and face her own deposition from being queen, or even worse, death. But she chooses to go ahead and do that, showing a great amount of courage. And she goes to the king, and she asks for the king and Haman to attend a banquet, if you recall, they do, and all Esther does is ask for another banquet. And in the meantime, it just so happened the king couldn't sleep. No reason, but he just couldn't sleep. And so he had the Chronicles read to him through the night. And in the reading of those Chronicles, he found out that Mordecai had never been honored. And so he determines to honor Mordecai. And he does so by asking Haman what ought to be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. And Haman, being the proud guy he was, thought, that's me. And so Haman outlines this outlandish plan to honor himself. But in turn, unfortunately, the king says, okay, go and do that with Mordecai. Hated Mordecai. And so Haman is humiliated while Mordecai is honored. That is followed then by the second banquet that Esther has with the king and Haman. And it's there that Haman himself and his plot are exposed. And as a result of that, another edict comes that the Jews would be allowed to defend themselves. And that's where we left off. The holy war that the Jews conducted against those who attacked them. And again, just a reminder that was not a war where the Jews went out to find these other people, but it was those people who attacked the Jews that were a part of the destruction. So that's where we are. Again, I think the timeline here is interesting. The book of Esther is about a 10-year period of time, but there's gaps of time that are not necessarily clear in the book. So for instance, when the story opens and the king is having his banquets, that's in 483. Vashti is deposed at that time. But this process of bringing all the beautiful women of the empire together, putting them into the harem, and then the procession of each of the individuals in the harem before the king that leads to Esther's being crowned is not until 479. Okay, so you see where Esther joins the harem, and then there's 3 years before she's crowned. So there's a gap of time there. And then where we're ending up here with the edict to defend themselves is here. They don't have to actually carry out that edict until here. So again, there's a gap of several months in there between when the king finds out that Haman has this plot and the Jews are going to be allowed to defend themselves. The defending of themselves doesn't take place until the very end there. So I think it's important to kind of see the sequence of events there. And here's kind of where we find ourselves after the fact that they are going to be able to defend themselves. Esther 8:17, in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. The battle's been won, they've been preserved, they have not been wiped out. And many from the people of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. And then Esther chapter 9, verses 17 through 19. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th and rested on the 15th day, making that day a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as the day of gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. So you can see there's a little bit of difference between the rural Jews and the city Jews. Okay? So people that lived within the walled cities celebrate the day later than those who were in the country. And that's still, to a degree, practiced today. Purim is on a particular day, but the day after that is also celebrated as well in Jerusalem, I believe, alone. So that's where we are. Real quickly, thinking back, as opposed to this feast, we have 7 feasts that were outlined in the book of Leviticus. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." And so you have the Sabbath day that's observed weekly. Then annually you have the Passover / unleavened bread. That's kind of all scrunched together in one big feast. You have the Feast of First Fruits. You have the Feast of Weeks or Harvest that we commonly call Pentecost. It's called Pentecost because it comes 50 days after the celebration of first fruits. And then you have the Feast of Trumpets, which nowadays is Rosh Hashanah, which is the New Year. And then you have the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Booths that celebrates the time Israel spent in the wilderness living in tents. And so those are the feasts of the Levitical setting. So I say that just to kind of set the stage for asking a couple of questions later on. So let's go ahead and listen as Max McLean reads this entire passage, and then we'll get into the details.
These things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them, for Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots to crush and to destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land, and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the king of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people.
So that's the story and its conclusion. So let's just take a look at some of the details. Of course, the main characters in this section are Mordecai, and really, even though the book is called Esther, Mordecai seems to be the central character in the book, not Esther. Esther seems to be the kind of the secondary, what would you call that person? Anyway, second in notoriety in the book. And of course, Queen Esther. And then you have the Jews as a whole in this. Notably absent in terms of really being a character in this section is Ahasuerus. We'll talk a little bit more about him and some of the interesting things that we see in this section about Ahasuerus as we go along here. So, real quickly, what we're going to see in this section is the whole act of remembering preservation, memorializing what has happened. And so you have Mordecai's decree going out about remembering. You have the establishment of that remembrance called Purim. And then you have Queen Esther's confirmation of that. And then you have Mordecai's greatness as the conclusion, the epilogue to the book. So let's take a look at each of these sections here. So Mordecai's command, or communique I should say, although it does kind of take the nature of a command, it's interesting. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of Ahasuerus, both near and far. And so here again, you kind of have a contrast between, if you recall, back in the earlier chapters, Haman has his edict approved by the king, and Haman, who at that time was number 2 in the kingdom, sends out his edict to all the provinces as well. So the same mechanism that was used to promulgate that edict to kill the Jews is used to communicate with the Jews the need to celebrate. And so he not only sends that letter, but he writes it down. And you're going to see now in this section, again, a repeated emphasis on writing things down. So what is the importance of that? Why the repeated emphasis on the writing of things down, recording of them?
Keep their history accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know, oral history, groups that rely on oral history are amazingly good at keeping things straight. But there's always the danger of things not getting transmitted the way you want them to get transmitted. So oral history is great if everybody's faithful and really truly passing on that oral history. But if you write it down, if it gets written down, that kind of solidifies it. How does that play out in the earlier chapters of Esther?
King can't sleep, so he has the records read in that reminds him that he never did anything. So.
If the good act of Mordecai in preserving Ahasuerus from the assassination attempt hadn't been written down, that could have never been read during the king's sleepless night. So very significant that it was written down. And for whatever reasons, it seems as though the Medes and the Persians were very adamant about writing everything down in these chronicles. And so, yeah, it's important that things be memorialized in writing. That's been drilled into me from the time I was a kid, you know. If you want to remember it, write it down. And the times I don't write things down, I tend to forget. In fact, you know, one of my regrets in life is that I didn't sit down with my two grandmothers. My two granddads were gone by the time I was born. But I didn't sit down with my two grandmothers, and I didn't sit down with my mom and dad and write down their histories. I wish I had done that. And I need to do it for my own kids now, without them having to ask for them. So it's important to write things down. And so Mordecai not only writes it down, but he sends out the letter about the holiday. So this is to be an annual celebration. In addition to those that we found in Leviticus, this is to be remembered as well. So he obliges them to keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and also the 15th day of the same year by year. And again, keep in mind, The reason it's 14th and 15th is the rural folk celebrated it one day, the people within the walled cities celebrated it another day. So he obliges them to observe those 2 days as this holiday. So what authority does Mordecai have to oblige the Jews to observe these holidays?
Well, the king's edict was given, and he gave him that authority.
Okay, so from a political point of view, he has the king's backing in this, and so the king is going to support Mordecai, who is second in command. What other authority does he have? I mean, think of yourself as a Jew in the outlying areas, and here you get this letter from Mordecai, and he says you are being obligated to observe this holiday. How are you going to react to that in terms of how you perceive Mordecai?
He saved our skin, I'll be happy to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other ideas?
Well, surely they heard that he's second in command to the king now.
Absolutely. And so from that perspective, they're going to say, okay, we better do it. But I think there's also another level of authority that he has. And that is the authority that he has gained because of his own actions. His own actions, number one, in being loyal to the king and seeking the peace and welfare of the people, the Jewish people. But also then what he does in response to the edict of Haman in appealing to Esther to appeal to the king. And so I think he has kind of a moral authority that he can kind of exert at this point as well to obligate them to this observance. That term obligate is repeated here several times through this passage. So I think there's a significance to that it wasn't just, hey, let's have a party and maybe we'll do this every year. It's no, this you must do, not only this year, but annually. And it's going to get that emphasis is going to be repeated here. And so it is to be an annual celebration in perpetuity. And notice the transformation here in verse 22. I thought my new glasses would help me read that, but it's, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days of sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So, what was the purpose of the observance?
To feast and have fun.
Yeah,
Sorrow to gladness.
yeah.
To
Go ahead, Hector.
to remember that they were saved.
Yeah.
They were rescued.
Exactly. There was this was a big deal.
Yeah.
They were about to be destroyed,
Yeah.
and yet they were preserved. And so that's a good reason to have a holiday, is it not?
And a reason why they would respect Mordecai's authority.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely, absolutely.
Their sorrow was turned to gladness.
Yeah, and that's the next question. What are the specific reversals that are being memorialized here? I think there's at least 3 of them here, and maybe one other one that we could mention. Actually 4. There's 4 of them here. What are the reversals that they have experienced?
Well, fear of being obliterated.
Yeah, from the fear of this imminent destruction to salvation, preservation. Hector?
Sorrow to joy.
Yeah, sorrow to joy. If you go back in chapter 5, they're sorrowing. They're in a bad way because the plot has been hatched and been made known. What else?
The mourning into a holiday. They thought it
Yeah.
was going to be a slaughter, and now they're having a big celebration
Yeah.
with food and sending gifts.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And fasting to feasting.
Yeah.
And It's funny because really it's kind of a three-part thing. There's feasting, but who's the feasting at the beginning? Yeah, all of the Persians, they're feasting, they're having a party, they're having multiple parties, but then comes the fasting on the part of the Jews, and now the Jews get to feast. And so what a contrast to the feasts of Ahasuerus and Vashti at the beginning of the story. What specific elements then are to be included, according to this section, in the observance of Purim?
Supposed to share food and give gifts to the poor.
Yeah, so really three elements here, the feasting, and then the sharing of food with one another, and then the giving gifts to the poor. And those elements continue to this day. So those are the elements that are to be included in Purim. So now the people get the letter. And what do? And here again, stop and think, what might you have done if you were a Jew in some far-flung area of the empire and you get this letter obligating you to observe this feast? What might be a human reaction to that, if you will?
Another thing to celebrate.
Yeah. Haven't we got enough? You know, we got these 7 celebrations, and you know they're kind of, you know, shouldn't we emphasize those even though we can't get to Jerusalem to celebrate them? You know, what else might be a human reaction to that?
Why are you telling me what to do?
Yeah. Who are you to tell me what to do on these days? What if I don't want to celebrate? What if something bad has just happened? I don't want to celebrate. But that's not their reaction. And it seems like this reaction was universal. It says the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. So it wasn't that they were resistant, but they were very accepting of that. And so that was the response to being obligated. And again, I think it's interesting, and you look down towards the end, in verse 27, it's not just that they accept it, they obligate themselves now. They say, okay, yeah, we want to do this, and we're gonna take it very seriously to the point of being obligated to do it. And so that's their response. And they're doing that, interestingly, not only for themselves, but they're promising to pass this on to their children, to their children, to their children. So
I just don't see it that way. I see it at like 4th of July. Like, this is a great opportunity to celebrate our freedom and what God has done for us. I'd be amazed if you got that letter and you were like, I don't want to do this. I guess there's people who don't like the 4th of July, but I do.
what would you say?
If you get a letter in the mail says, hey, from here on out, it's a 3-day weekend.
Yes! I'd be like, I'm in for
The
that.
12th month of the 13th day of the month.
Yes.
So I'm like, okay, so I get the 13th, 14th, and 15th.
Exactly.
I'm sure that's a reaction. More days off.
Me too.
But you know, I guess what I'm kind of turning my thinking toward is the obligation part.
Sure.
You know, people don't like to be told you have to do that. And I think even us, if we were told this is a law, you have to celebrate these holidays, and you not only have to celebrate, you got to obligate your children to observing them and their children and so forth. And I think there might be a little bit different reaction to that level, but they certainly were glad to, hey, you know, anything for a party, you know, anything for a party. Why at this point in verse 24, for Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them. Why now, at this point in the story, describe Haman this way? Because he's never described as completely as this.
Well, it's all come to light. There's no him trying to maneuver and make it happen. It's just like glaringly, this is what you were about, this is what you were trying to do. And
Yeah, I think for the Jews to say the reason we had to take up arms against these folks is Haman and his crowd were haters of the Jews and cursed by God. And so he is further described there, I think, as the reason why he's an enemy of the Jews, and therefore why this whole thing turned on his head
So do you
because
think
of
they
who
would
he
have
was.
picked up the Agagite reference?
Pardon me?
Do you think they would have been picking up on the Agagite
Yes.
reference and called out?
Yes.
That's why they did it?
Yeah, the Agagites were just, they were especially noted as enemies of the Jews, all the way from the time that they, the beginning of that was as the Jews are coming up from Egypt, and they do their wandering, but now they're headed to the Promised Land. The Amalekites attack them from behind. I mean, it's a devious, terrible thing that they did. And then, of course, once they're in the land, the Amalekites were always an issue, to the point where finally God asks Saul to destroy them all. And he doesn't. And the result of that is Haman. So,
I think the reason I agree with them about the festivity,
Uh-huh.
the whole thing, because the other holidays that they are reminded of are more sobering. And they're not as festive. Even when they were
Hanukkah.
released from Egypt, there was there was still fasting, from yeast. There was still, hardship that they recall and went through. And so there was more of a pleasant spirit to the
yeah.
whole thing.
And we'll talk about that a little bit further along too, but you're absolutely right on.
Well, and I think the reminder of Haman casting lots, that just represents chance. This, God preserving the Jews, that's his providence.
That's a
Good point.
Well, and even in the casting of lots, what does the book of Proverbs tell us about the
God.
casting of lots?
Yeah.
You can throw the dice, but the outcome is in God's hands. So, and that's very true here. Very true here as well. So take a look at verse 25. I find this verse very interesting. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that Haman's evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Is there a note of sarcasm in that verse? And if so, what is the sarcasm here? Sarcasm is kind of making fun of power that is either illegitimate or not as true in reality as perceived.
Hanging of his sons.
Okay, well I don't know if that's sarcasm, that's good
I mean,
comeuppance.
The point is, I didn't know that his sons got hanged also.
They did, but later, if you remember the chart of the timeline, the dotted circle, that's when Haman gets hanged.
Oh, okay.
The sons get hanged down at the end when the Jews do battle against those that attack them.
I think Haman was really close to getting that throne. He could
Oh,
have.
he was. Or a throne anyway. I don't think Ahasuerus would have, granted anything beyond that.
But he would have won a lot of the people instead of Mordecai, if it would have been him.
Could have
that
been.
walked the streets.
But what about King Ahasuerus in that sentence there? It came before the king. He gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head.
Not me. Even though he had to give the signet ring to sign it, so Haman couldn't have done it without him. The king's like, this wasn't me, not me, it's
Yeah.
all Haman. Make sure y'all know it.
Well, stop and think about Ahasuerus' attitude in this whole story. When Haman comes to him and presents him with this people that aren't like you and aren't like our kingdom and are not beneficial to you, we should wipe them out. How does the king respond to that?
He doesn't even look into it.
Kind of casually,
Yeah,
okay,
Sure.
okay, kill them, Well, I don't, he doesn't ask who they are, really why they, And now to turn on the other hand and say that the good outcome is to be attributed to Ahasuerus, Yeah, I don't think so.
I think it's because it kind of borders on the eye of the king, it borders on blasphemy, because like the other nations they conquered, they still worshiped a different form of, whether if it's Horus, well, over here in this country, you know, it's Baal, whether if it's Anubis, but over here in this country, you know, it's Asheroth.
Yep.
So they still love, you can keep your gods, because whatever you call them, as long as you're paying me my tribute,
Yeah.
and it's all good. But these funny, peculiar folks over here, they worship a foreign god that you don't, they don't bow to your gods, they don't bow to you. There's like a deification of a god king,
Mhm.
kind of, you know what I mean, that the kings were almost deified. So it's like, okay, well, this is, I can't tolerate that type of sedition in my kingdom then. If what you say is true, then by all means, wipe them out, you know? And then when it turns out it's not that type of hype, then it's like, okay, well, you set them up, so you're gonna have to, you're gonna have to do what, the consequence for that, if you're, you know what I mean? What you're kind of accusing them of, so now you're going to have to suffer that consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so Ahasuerus is kind of this despot that just kind of is going with the flow to a degree, but, you know, boy, when something happens that he ought to be given credit. Now, is there a reason why the writer may have gone ahead and given Ahasuerus credit here?
Well, he's still used by God.
Yeah, and you want people who are reading this to not look down on the king to where now he becomes
The bad guy.
kind of upset with you because you're not giving him the props that he deserves.
Right.
But when we read it, when we're reading it, oops, what's going on? How come? Let's see here. Come on. Okay, something happened. Let me. There we go. As we read in our time frame, what king do we know really turned the thing around? We know it was God who turned it around, not King Ahasuerus. But even in the story itself, it really wasn't the king. It was the courage and initiative of Mordecai and Esther that really made a difference. The king's just signing off on it, probably because Esther was his beautiful queen. And, you know, had any circumstance been a little bit different, I can see Ahasuerus doing the exact opposite and saying, yeah, go ahead and kill them all. You know, and so I think there's sarcasm throughout the book, but I think in that particular verse there's a significant sarcasm. So then you get to the details of Purim, and so verses 26 and 27. Therefore they call these days Purim after the term Pur. Therefore, because all that was written in this letter and of what they had faced in this matter and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year. So they've committed themselves to the observance of this holiday. And they have successfully done that. And so how though does Purim differ from the Levitical feasts? Wendy touched on this. This is where Wendy's comment fits in. Any other ideas on how Purim and the celebration of Purim is different from the Levitical feasts?
There doesn't seem to be as many rules and regulations.
Okay.
Because I think on all the other feasts, you have to bring a sacrifice to the temple. This one you don't. So I don't want to say they're more pointed toward God, because this is also remembering God just saved you, but they are more heavily focused on remembering God did this, therefore you do this.
Okay. Good. obviously, go ahead, Hector.
Also, I would say every single Israel feast is designed to remind Israel of their sinful nature. Every single, like every one of them, from to have the
That's
Passover
good.
lamb,
Point.
to have to take the leaven out of the bread, and do that, and then now you have to give your
First
feast, your
fruits.
first fruits, right, of the flocks or of the herds. And then now you're going back into, you have to deal with the trumpets blast, and the judgment of that, you have to deal with the Day of Atonement, where the high priest have to give a sacrifice for himself first and his family, then for all of Israel, and praying for forgiveness, and then go into the Holy of Holies, and then the tabernacles. So every single feast is designed to let you know, you guys don't cut the mustard. You know?
True.
Yeah,
True.
yeah, that's a big
It's only
difference
because
between
of
that
me
and Purim.
that you guys are, you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Absolutely. Ted?
Since Esther doesn't ever refer to God in the book, okay, this one is originated from either Mordecai or whatever, and all the other celebrations, the Bible explicitly says it
Right.
came from God through Moses.
Exactly.
So,
And that's a difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second too, and come back to the question, well then, is Purim a legitimate thing to celebrate for a Jew today? Or even between this time frame and the time of Christ. So the Feast of Purim, a lot of things a part of that. So I wanted to show you a couple of little videos here that describe how Purim is being celebrated today. So here's a celebration in Jerusalem.
We are not celebrating Halloween. My name is India, and we are going to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Purim here in Israel. Purim is a Jewish holiday that commemorates the saving of the Jewish people from an evil man named Haman. You see, thousands of years ago, Haman had a plan to try and kill all of the Jews. But his plan failed. And now, this is how we celebrate today. Right now, we are in Israel. And because most of the population here is Jewish, Purim is a big deal here. Purim happens every year around the end of winter and beginning of spring. In Israel, if you walk down the streets just before Purim, you will see so many costume stores. One of the biggest Purim traditions is to dress up. This is because the famous Queen Esther, who helped save the Jewish people in the Purim story, had to hide the fact that she was Jewish. Today, some of the most popular costumes people wear are biblical characters like Abraham. Israelis love to go out to the streets and party in their costumes. Entire streets become filled. And do you remember that evil man named Haman? Well, there is a special way to remember his defeat. With these. Yes, these here are cookies, and they are called hamantashen, but in Israel they say oznei Haman. This means the ears of Haman in Hebrew. They are triangles because they represent the ears of the evil Haman. Inside of the cookie is usually filled with jelly or chocolate. One other really important tradition of Purim is to actually read the Purim stories, which can be found in the book of Esther, known as the Megillah. For thousands of years, Jews have been celebrating Purim. Purim is a celebration of victory over evil. It is something we can all celebrate. So, if you want to celebrate Purim, dress up, eat some hamantashen cookies, and read the book of Esther, which can be found in the Bible. This is how you celebrate Purim. This is Inside Israel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
So that's the celebration part. Now, as they mentioned, there's also the reading of the Megillah Esther, and it's read twice, once the night before and then once during the day. And tradition holds that you're supposed to listen to that reading, and the readers have to read every word. And if they think that people haven't heard the word, they have to go back and repeat it, because it's supposed to be heard by everyone, and that's true for both days. And so I'm going to show you a little clip. I'm going to show a little clip and then jump ahead to another little bit of a part of the reading of modern day reading of Esther here. So let's do it this way.
Esther in different parts of the Megillah that the congregation reads a sentence ahead of the reader. So I will stop, and then you will say that sentence, and then I'll repeat it. So how will you know which sentence? So we have our congregation assistant here, Nina, and whenever she holds up the sign which shows the congregation, you know it's your turn to say that verse. All right? We have a deal? Yeah, okay. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו מצוותיו וציוונו על מקרא מגילה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
I'm going to jump ahead now.
ותהי אסתר נשאת חן בעיני קוראיה, ותיקח אסתר, ותילקח אסתר אל מלך אחשוורוש, אל בית מלכותו בחודש העשירי וחודש טבת, בשנת 7 למלכותו. ויהב המלך את אסתר מכל הנשים, ותסכן לחסד לפניו מכל הבתולות, וישם כתר מלכות בראשה, וימלכה תחת ושתי. ויעש המלך משתה גדול לכל שריו ועבדיו, אין משתה אסתר, ונפל תמונות עשה, ויתן מסע כיד המלך, ופי וימצא.
Chapter, we are on the 3rd chapter, which is on page 14, towards the top of page 14.
Listen for the name Haman.
המלך אחשוורוש את המן. ונבטת הגגי וינשאו, וישם את כיסאו מעל כל השרים אשר איתו, וכל עבדי המלך אשר בשער המלך, קוראים ומשתחווים להמן. כי כן ציווה לו המלך ומרדכי, לא יכרע ולא ישתחווה, ויאמרו עבדי המלך אשר בשער המלך למול.
So that's the celebration today, you know. So they are faithfully doing what was laid out all the way back in the book of Esther. So let's quickly move ahead here. And again, notice in the remembering and the preservation, it's recorded. It's recorded. That these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city. And that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So just putting it down in writing and saying, this is what we're going to do every year. And it's been faithfully done so throughout the centuries. We'll skip that question because we kind of touched on it. So now Queen Esther sends a letter. So the Queen Esther, the daughter of Abhail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. So the first letter is Mordecai's letter. Now this is the second letter that Queen Esther sends out. So what is the significant addition here to Esther's description? Throughout the rest of the book, it's just Esther. What's added here? Her lineage. What had been kept secret for so long? Her lineage. Her ethnic origin. And now, no. Esther is clearly being identified with the Jews. She is a Jew. She is the queen. And she is still the queen, even though she is a Jew. And so that is added to that. Why does Esther need to write this second letter? Wasn't Mordecai's letter enough?
She's a rank up.
Yeah. she carries a little bit more authority in some senses. And so we not only need the word of Mordecai, we need the confirmation of royalty. And Queen Esther is the one to do that. And so she writes this letter. And these, again, are sent all across the entire empire to the 127 provinces of Ahasuerus. And notice the nature of these letters. In fact, commentators say that the letter probably started with the salutation, words of peace and truth. And so quite a difference there. And so, yeah, Haman's letter would not be characterized by peace and truth, would it not? It would probably be characterized in the exact opposite. An interesting contrast is that you can compare it to is Psalm 120. Psalm 120 talks about the plight of a Jew living in a foreign context of people that like to do war. And that seems to be all they want to do. And the psalm ends with the psalmist saying, I am of peace, but they all only want war. And that's kind of the contrast between Haman's letter and now Mordecai and Esther's letter. You know, it's quite the contrast. And so what elements now are added by Esther to the celebration? These, I think, got lost in translation through the years. Take a look at the end of verse 31. She's saying there ought to be fasts. There ought to be lamenting. It's not just a party. Why should they fast and why should they lament?
Well, and
Remember how
Jews were,
close they came.
To remember how close they came and what
Thank
else?
God.
and Jews were killed
Yeah.
in the fighting going back and forth. There were Jews lost.
Yes,
They weren't all,
right.
you know.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to this understanding of who we are before
Yes.
an absolutely holy and righteous God. That in the midst of our celebrating, we need to be reminded of who we are and what we are. And so there needs to be lamenting and fasting as well. And so Esther confirms all of the practices of Purim and putting them in writing. And again, notice the documentation. She put it in writing. She put it in writing. Now here's a good question. The Jews have been saved. Mordecai and Esther have been blessed and honored. What reasons for and what source of their preservation and blessing seems to be conspicuously unmentioned? And think in terms of even that first video that I showed you. What did she not even talk anything about? God. This was just Mardi Gras for the Jews.
That's what I was starting to look at it like, man, it's kind of like secular stuff going on.
Yeah. And Esther is a secular book, and we struggle with that. And I think Mordecai and Esther were rather secular. And in fact, in your handout, I've attached a summary of the two books, Ruth and Esther, and some conclusions of Ruth and Esther from Tom Constable. And the conclusion that Tom Constable writes about Esther addresses this idea of what kind of Jew were Mordecai and what kind of Jewess was Esther. And I think the whole book reeks of secularism, and yet God's there. It's God at work. It's God's hand. And so, even in what we read here, you don't see God mentioned. And now in the celebration of it, it's just, hey, it's time to party. You know, it's Mardi Gras. It's St. Patrick's Day in Boston. It's, it's Halloween to a degree, although that's the comparison she made in the video. But I think Mardi Gras and St. Patrick's Day in Chicago and Boston is probably more. It's just let's let ourselves go and just party like there's no tomorrow, you know. So God was the source of their preservation, not King Ahasuerus, not Esther, not Mordecai. It was God that preserved them. And the blessing comes because God's grace. I mean, why are the Jews in Persia in the first place?
Because of their secularism.
Yeah, because of their secularism, their unfaithfulness to God and His covenant. And so, you know, wow, for God to bless them now with preservation and the opportunity to party, that needs to be accounted for. So now Mordecai's greatness, this last section, we're going to have to go real quickly here. So King Ahasuerus imposed a tax on the land on the coastlands of the sea. For Mordecai was second, and so Mordecai rises in prominence. Why include this tidbit about Ahasuerus levying taxes?
He's just been a king.
Yeah, you know, if you remember when Esther is crowned, what does Ahasuerus do? He cuts taxes because this is good for him, you know. I'm celebrating something good for me. I've got a new queen. But when the Jews have been preserved and saved, what does Ahasuerus do? Oh, let's raise taxes again. It just shows this almost arbitrariness of Ahasuerus' domination, if you will. And so I think that's why it's there. Don't think Ahasuerus is any good guy. He's not. And so he's raised up. Mordecai's legacy. The full account of the high honor of Mordecai to which the king of man said, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia? So not only does Mordecai and Esther and whoever wrote the book Esther, not only do they record these acts, they got official recognition in the King's Chronicles. So that's a significant legacy. You know, I think it's much like Billy Graham in at least fairly contemporary times. He has a place in secular history books for what he stood for, what he did, and so that's a high legacy. That's a high legacy. And then his leadership. His leadership was that he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to his people. What's significant about that statement relative to a prophetic statement by Jeremiah? What does Jeremiah command the people in Babylon to do? Seek the welfare of the people and the peace. And so he's doing that in not Babylon now, but in Persia, doing what Jeremiah directed them to do. We're going to skip those to go on here. So, some applications real quickly. Oops. Number one, celebrate God's providence in preserving His people. We need to mark the occasions where we see God at work. I'm afraid the Jews of Persia didn't recognize what God was doing. They just thought it was a great coincidence that all this thing worked out to where they were able to be preserved. I don't know how much they stopped and said, and God did that for us. And I think even today, the celebration has become the thing. Why do we celebrate? Because we want to celebrate. We like celebrating this. Not coming together and saying, God has preserved us.
I mean, to their credit, they're still reading it in the synagogue. They're still going through
They are.
booing whenever Haman's, and they're cheering whenever Esther's name is mentioned and stuff like that. So, I mean, even in the midst of all of their parades and festivities, they're still in the synagogue, and the rabbis there singing the scriptures, so all the little kids can memorize it from song.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there is a positive there. There is a positive there. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what things has God done in our personal life and what things has God done in our community life that we ought to be celebrating. And some we may ought to be celebrating every year. You know, in working with schools, I told them, you know, every year as a board, you ought to say, okay, let's take a look back. What did God do this year? And what thing should we memorialize in some way? Either in some visible, physical way or by some thing that we commit to doing and remembering year in and year out. And I think we need to do that as a church too. You know, we need to celebrate those things because they are God's providence. Share God's goodness with others. You know, I think it was a wise thing that Mordecai said. Don't just make this a thing about yourself and being able to party, but share with others and provide for the poor that need help. And so those two things I think were very, very important. We need to generously share the blessings that we have received from God as well, particularly with those in need. We need to live with integrity, courage, and compassion. I think those are the characteristics of Mordecai. You know, he certainly had integrity. He was loyal to the king. He didn't go outside the bounds of what was appropriate and what was morally right and what was legal in that day. And he certainly showed courage and then in compassion as well, and caring for the people the way he did. And then as we look at the whole book as a whole, we need to see the unseen hand of God. You know, I know that's an oxymoron, but we do. We know that God, regardless of whether we recognize it or not, whether or not we understand it or not, God is at work, and He's at work constantly in our lives. And so we need to be attentive to the ways in which He is working in all of the circumstances of life. And then we need to trust in God's plan. You know, there may be times that are kind of tough. Times where we say, God, where are you? And if you want to see examples of that, read through the book of Psalms. And frequently in the book of Psalms, the psalmist says, God, where are you? Why are you not answering me? You seem to be distant. And yet, we need to trust that God is at work. He's at work for the good of His people, Romans 8:28, even in dark and troublesome times. God was at work in the grand victory that the Jews won. He was at work when they were near extinction. Okay? We could say the same, for instance, even in the Holocaust. God was at work then. We don't understand why He allowed, you know, millions of Jews and millions of others to lose their life, but He was at work, and we need to trust that. We just don't know how or why in that regard. So, like I said, I did include in your handout a summary of the two books, and so we'll not ask questions about that.